Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for visiting the Sixth Floor Museum today. My name is Stephen Fagan. I'm the curator here. And this is a special living history program, an opportunity to highlight our ongoing oral history project at the museum, which has recorded to date more than 2,000 interviews with people from around the world, exploring the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy and the broader history and culture of the 1960s. And you're in for a treat today because we have a very special guest joining us, Marvin Scott, who has been a journalist for more than 60 years, since selling your first photograph, I think, at the age of 14.
14, yes.
And you have since won 12 Emmys, possibly 13 just while we're sitting here. And you have also interviewed some 30,000 people, I understand?
That's my estimate. 30,000 over the course of 60 years, yes.
And that includes 6 presidents.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about at least one of them today. So this will be a very interesting conversation, talking primarily about Marvin's experiences during the 1960s. So please join me in welcoming Marvin Scott to share his story today.
Thank you.
All right, Marvin, we're going to take a trip way back and see you here in 1960. I appreciate you being photographed with a calendar on the wall so we can know exactly when this picture was taken. So tell us a little bit about where you were in 1960 when you took this picture of Senator John F. Kennedy.
This was in Charleston, West Virginia, the day he announced his candidacy into the West Virginia primary. It was a primary he had to win in order to gain that nomination. And he came in at a time when Senator Hubert Humphrey, was way ahead by, I think, 70 points to Kennedy's 30 points. And Kennedy walked in, he was a different image. He walked in the Ivy League image, tall, good-looking man who knew how to engage people. I've long maintained that communication skills are more important than political skills, and he knew how to master them. Because here he was in the heart of the Appalachia. You had a lot of coal miners there, a lot of people who were not at poverty, but near poverty level, and they needed hope. And what John Kennedy did, he at least guaranteed them hope if he would become president. And he started overcoming, taking over the lead away from Hubert Humphrey. And about 4 weeks before the May primary, the religious issue struck. People in West Virginia said they did not know he was Catholic, and that became an issue. And Kennedy said, "You've denied me the presidency since I was baptized." And he went on to pledge that not only the Constitution, but he swore that he would uphold the laws of the land and the Constitution by swearing on a Bible. And he hit hard with that message and began to overcome the lead that Hubert Humphrey had. And when they had the final primary in May, I believe the number was Kennedy surpassed Humphrey by, I have the number here, by 60% of the vote. And he was so successful that I believe it was Hubert Humphrey who backed out at that point, and Kennedy went on to win the nomination, and it was a crucial moment in the Kennedy campaign, and of course he went on to become president.
Absolutely. And you got to spend a little time with him. You got to talk with him and take these great pictures that we're looking at here. I want to ask you, since you've been on television for such a long time, and we often consider John F. Kennedy to be our first real television president, talk for a moment about the masterful way in which Kennedy utilized that burgeoning medium of television.
Well, he knew how to engage people. That was the magic of John F. Kennedy. I watched him before he went before a camera. He would deal with the people. He would handshake. He would put his arm around them. He would talk to them. And he assured them that if he became the president, he would help these people in the heart of Appalachia. And that's what they wanted. He provided them with hope, and he was credible enough. You know, he walked in wearing these expensive suits and wearing expensive shoes. He'd walk through the mud in the coal fields to greet the miners. And that was his magic of communicating with these people. And he knew how to play it when he got on television. And we saw those debates with Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon was sweating And images really have an impact on viewers. And that impacted, I think, many of the viewers. But Kennedy was just so overwhelming with personality. He just captured the voters. And he won that primary, which led a couple of months later to him getting the nomination for president.
Yeah. Now, jumping forward a little bit, November 22nd, 1963. At this point, you're with the United Press International Television in New York. Where were you when you heard the news?
Well, at the offices, and we heard there were teletypes. Today we deal with computers. We don't have those teletypes clanking all the way in through a newsroom anymore. Well, I heard bells going off. We saw, got a bulletin, and it started off with United Press International trying to break into the wire. It was Boise, Idaho was on the circuit at the time, and it said, get off of this wire. I have the note of the time. It was like 1:51 Eastern Standard Time. It said, stay off this wire. President JFK was shot and perhaps fatally wounded today. And that was the first message the world received that he shots fired at the Kennedy motorcade. And it was a couple of hours later at 2:35, 10 bells. 10 bells signified a flash, which is something we rarely saw. It was an outbreak of war, or the assassination of someone. And there's just 3 words: Kennedy, President Kennedy, dead. 3:51, Johnson president. Another 10 bells flash. And the world was dropped into shock. It was one of the darkest moments in American history. It was unbelief. I mean, a disbelief, people shaking their heads and walking around, and they just didn't know how to deal with it. And I know the tears flowed, and I was out on the street in New York getting reaction of people, and they just shook their heads and they said, "This is not true, not true." They could not accept it. They could not accept the fact that the President of the United States had been assassinated. And I know for that weekend, it was very difficult in homes and all across the place. I was out on the street. Mark Lane, who had some connection to a Fair Play for Cuba community, looking for interviews with him out on Broadway, where they turned off the lights in the marquee in Times Square, and I raced into a theater where they just turned off the light. I said, "Turn it on again, I want to get a shot. I want to get a shot." So he turned the light on again, got the shot, the marquee lights going out, and then turning them, putting it on and getting out again. It was a difficult weekend, all climaxed on that Sunday when on live television we saw Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby. It was all unbelievable. It was surreal. I think that's a word, surreal. It was all surreal and unbelievable. People loved John F. Kennedy, the man, and the president. He was exuded the youth of this country. He and his wife Jacqueline, coming out of so many presidents who were so much older, here was a young man, young wife, and it was a time for change. And John F. Kennedy brought that change about. It was a tough weekend, and I remember it well, as all of you who lived through it at that time. And for those of you who didn't live through it at that time, just hearing about it or reading about it, it should also, leave an impact on you, an indelible image, which is left in my mind of that horrible weekend.
You've covered a lot of tragic events in your career. We're going to talk about a couple of them coming up. But for an event like the Kennedy assassination, this is a man you had met. The picture we're looking at here is a picture you took of him very close. When you are personally, emotionally affected by a story, how do you balance that with the professionalism of being a newsman having to cover a story?
It's a good question, Stephen. It's difficult. Early on in my career, I would cover a tragedy and it would stay with me for days. And after a while, just as a doctor, you have to become immune to it, that you can't let it live inside of you. You report and you try and keep your emotion out of the report. On 9/11, on the air, I think someone saw a tear drop, and I was not embarrassed by that at all. I think that was one time, probably the only time, any emotion came through was during an interview with someone who was obviously who lost a loved one, because that person was on the top floor and this person believed that her father was still alive, and we knew it was just not possible. So that the sidetrack from that for a moment, but we report the story and tell the facts and leave the emotion out of it, because the emotion is coming from the people who are receiving the news, and we're not the ones who have to exude that emotion. So it's in the beginning it was difficult. I remember covering a story of a tragedy where several children died in a fire, and for days it lingered with me, and I said, no, it took a little bit of a while to really get adjusted to it. No emotion, just tell the story. Just the facts, man.
1966, we're approaching the third anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. By this time, you're working for Mutual Broadcasting Company, and you come to Dallas to do a radio documentary, and you're going to interview some folks. Let's start with your cab driver. Tell me about that interview you did with a Dallas cab driver about his memories of the assassination.
Well, he came from Central Casting. I remember the name so well, Carl Parham. My idea was to do a radio documentary in sound, and it was to start with a cab driver who was going to drive me along the route of the Kennedy motorcade and tell me what you saw, your remembrances, and then drop me off at different points where I would get off and I would do a thing and do a story there. And then he got to the point at Dealey Plaza, and he said, this is where the pictures were taken by the dress manufacturer, Abraham Zapruder. That's where I intended to cut and do the interview. And then we continued under the underpass to Parkland Hospital, went to the trauma room where I was doing a stand-up, just talking about what the situation was, and you heard the booming sound, the echo in the trauma room. But Carl was so reflective. It took about 3 cabs I got into at the airport. I tried 3 cab drivers. First one, it just didn't fit. The second one didn't fit. Carl was perfect. I said he came out of Central Casting. He was perfect for the role. He was so reflective, and just his delivery, he was wonderful. And that's how I got the call Parham.
So would you get into these cabs at the airport, talk to the guy for a minute, and if he didn't meet your expectations, you
drive me back to the airport.
Okay, all right, well, that's interesting. Marvin very, very generously donated his original interviews to the museum years ago, and I put together a little clip of Carl Parham as he does this driving tour of Dallas in 1966. The audio's a little rough because we're talking about an audio cassette that's almost 60 years old, but let's take a listen. You're going to ask a question, and then Carl's going to take it from there.
Yes, I imagine many people are coming down here just to take a look where it all happened a few years ago.
That's about the first thing that any visitors want to see, is the assassination site of the president. You'll notice even now, you notice the different license plates as we go along here. You find them all the way from Maine to Mexico, just in this small group here that's looking around now. I bet you can count a dozen different states. People of every race, color, and creed were lined up to welcome the man. His car would pull over, he'd shake hands with people, and Texans, they've got to show off a little bit. Actually, they liked him so well that they had to run their fingers through his hair and kid him about his bushy hair, You have to be a Texan to understand that. To us, that is not being rude or an insult. It's really showing your appreciation or that you like the person.
The entire interview is on our website, jfk.org. If you'll go to collections, you can listen to it, probably hear it a little bit better. But Carl was talking about all the people of different ages and different races that lined the motorcade route to welcome the Kennedys. I'm not sure he was really correct about people running their fingers through Kennedy's bushy hair, but that's a cab driver for you. Now, you secured a really tremendous interview while you were here in Dallas with this man right here, dress manufacturer Abraham Zapruder. Before you tell that story, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest in our audience. We have Abraham Zapruder's daughter, Myrna Reese, here with us today. Myrna, can you just wave to folks so they can see you here? I'm so happy that you could be here with us today to hear this remarkable story. So, Marvin, Abraham Zapruder really didn't do interviews.
No, he did not.
But you got one of 6 that he did after the assassination.
He begged off. I called him from a motel. I came here to do 2 documentaries. One was Dallas Revisited, revisiting 3 years after the assassination and talking to some key people and visiting some of the key sites. And also, I was doing one, Shadow of Doubt, dealing with the conspiracy theories. So I was at the motel. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Zapruder at his office at Jennifer Jr. And introduced myself, told him what I was doing, and he said, "Mr. Scott, thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest, but I don't do interviews." Well, I engaged him in conversation. Well, to do the quote from his granddaughter, Alexandra, who wrote the book 26 Seconds on page 174. She said, cajoling, pleading, good old-fashioned charm. And it was like a 15-minute conversation that I finally convinced him to do the interview. We were talking about it, and it got to a conversation. I knew he and his family, they were a Russian-Jewish family, came from Brooklyn. And somewhere in the conversation, I said, "Hey, I'm from the other side of the tracks. I'm a kid from the Bronx. Come on, you can't turn a kid down from the Bronx, someone from Brooklyn, and the family." And I knew that there was a Russian-Jewish family, and I said something in Yiddish, some word, and he said, he recognized him as a member of the same tribe who were both Jewish. And when he recognized that, he said, "Could you be here at 2:00?" That's what got the interview. And when I got to his office, I said, I appreciate this opportunity, Mr. Z, everyone called him Mr. Z, that Lillian Rogers, who was his secretary that day, she knew he loved JFK, and he was so thrilled that he was going to chance to see him, and he meant to bring his camera. He forgot his camera. Lillian said, "Mr. Z, go back home, come on, 20 minutes, he'll be back. When again, you get a chance to see the president." That's how he did it. He went home, got his camera, came back. So after he agreed to the interview, I said, "Oh, it's stuffy in here, just not about it. How about doing it downstairs?" He agreed to it. We walked down to the grassy knoll. He walked over to the concrete abutment where he had positioned himself on November 22nd, and it came along with Marilyn Sitzman, who was 20 years his junior. Mr. Z was in his 60s, I believe, and he started describing what he had seen. He saw the motorcade coming down Elm Street and coming into Dealey Plaza. He saw the president waving and smiling, and Jacqueline, and then suddenly I heard a shot. I saw the president lean over. I saw a Jacqueline lean over to help him. Then I heard a second shot. I saw his head explode, and he said, "I kept on shooting. I kept on filming. I started yelling, 'They killed him, they killed him.'" And he did not understand how he maintained his composure enough to hold the camera as steady as he did until the limousine went under that underpass. He said he felt he was probably paralyzed, frozen at that moment. And he said he heard 2 distinct shots. Now, the Warren Commission determined there were 3 shots. He did not refute that. He said he heard 1 shot hit the president. There was one through the neck. Then he heard the second shot hit him in the head. He said, to the 3rd shot, I didn't hear it. I was probably so traumatized, I didn't hear that. Now, one of the things that go about so often, and I'm sure you've heard them in all the theories and the conspiracy, that there was a second shot. The second shot coming from the grassy knoll behind a picket fence. Now, Mr. Z was standing about, by his words, 30 to 35 feet away from that picket fence. He was about 80 yards from the Texas School Book Depository building, this building. He told me very distinctly he heard 2 shots, clearly from his left ear and behind. That would have been 80 yards away, the book depository building. The same sound was heard by Marilyn Sitzman, distinctly, 2 clear pops. If there was a third shot, as many of the conspiracy theorists say, that came from the grassy knoll behind that picket fence, which was 30 feet away from where he was standing, would have been a deafening sound in his right ear. He did. And I have all these years believed, based upon what he and Marilyn told me, that there was that one shooter at the Texas School Book Depository building. So, but the questions still persist. 60 years later. There's another film out. Orville Nix, who is suing the government now. He claims 60 years later, the family claims that he has video taken from the other side, the opposite side from where Zapruder was standing. And it shows the grassy knoll. The museum has a copy of that, but it's not the original. The original apparently is lost, and the family claims that the government is covering something up by not releasing that film. They're suing like $29 million. But again, based upon what Mr. Zapruder told me and Marilyn Sitzman told me, they clearly heard those 2 shots from left and behind. Nothing from right close where they were standing. So I read also about missing frames. If you read up on all of it, he talked about frames 207 to 212 that were missing, 4 frames. Now, when you take the film, then there's the frame 313, which some people claim he said he had nightmares over, and that he told Life magazine, which paid him about $150,000 for the rights to publish the pictures, not to publish. That one frame would not have shown anything. The camera he used, the Bell & Howell camera he used, moved 18.5 frames per second, I think. And he said that would have been 1/25th of a second if something was taken out. As far as the 4 frames, 211 or 27 or 12, I got the numbers off, it was in that range. He said it would not have made a difference. And he said if it was a splice in there, it probably happened during a showing. I used a lot of 8mm film in my earlier years, and I spliced film. It sometimes would tear in the sprockets, and so he saw no mystery in all the conspiracies. And the film, he said to me very clearly, and he said he didn't look at it. He hadn't seen the film. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to possess it either. There were only 3 copies of the film. Initially, when he shot the film on November 22nd, he knew what he had. And I think he had Lillian Rogers, his secretary, call the Secret Service here. They came and they took the film from him. They tried to get it processed at a local newspaper. They didn't have a facility to do it. And it was finally that evening, about 9 o'clock that night, they got a lab here in Dallas to process the film, and they saw, this was the most graphic images you ever saw of a murder happening. And so the 3 copies, one the FBI, the Secret Service, the FBI, and one they gave to him initially. He claimed he never saw it, didn't want to see it. And that film gave rise to the Warren Commission concluding it was one shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, but also gave rise to all the conspiracy theories. People found problems. They found conspiracy over missing frames, location, and sadly, even 60 years later, some of those questions still arise. And I would say, as a journalist, there are some questions that arise for me too. The government has released so many documents, but there is still their withholding. And I think until they're all released, we're not going to have a picture of the true, complete story. Why not release them all? And that's my story. I don't think I've missed anything about. Oh,
You went to Zapruder's house.
that's what I was going to
Tell me about that.
So I wanted to take him and Marilyn Sitzman, and I told Mr. Z, you'll bring Lillian along. He said, nah, I want you to come. I want my wife to meet the nice boy from New York. I brought to the house. So I came to the house and we shot pool and had cocktails. And he went to the cabinet and he pulled out a camera, and it was unopened. It was from Bell Howell. The camera Bell and Howell gave him was they in exchange for taking his camera for their archives, and it hadn't been opened. And he told me he could not put his eye to the viewfinder again because it brought all those memories back. He just could not see that vision. And if any of you have seen the film, you would understand that. I mean, it is horrific. You see a president who is so well loved by this country being murdered. And I don't think there's any more graphic image that exists anywhere.
We're actually going to see it in just a moment. I want to acknowledge that about 20 years ago, for a news story you were doing at the 40th anniversary, you had the brilliant idea of taking narration from your audio interview and using it over the film to narrate. Abraham Zapruder narrating his own home movie of the Kennedy assassination. And what we've done is we've replicated that.
It took 40 years to accomplish that. Because after I did the interview with Mr. Zapruder, and I saw the film, I felt if ever I get my hands on that film, I could sync a portion of that interview to make it sound like he's narrating it. Well, I couldn't get it initially because it was owned by Time Life, and then the Library of Congress had it. And after 40 years, it was, I think the government gave the Zapruder family, if I'm not mistaken, $16 million for the, was it 16 or 16 million?
Around there.
Yeah, that's a couple of zeros. The family gave the licensing rights to the film to the Sixth Floor Museum. At that point, I said, let me give it a shot. So I called the then curator, Gary Mack, and basically said, you have something I want, and I have something I think you will want. Let's make a deal. We did. He overnighted me the film. I overnighted him a copy of my audio interview with Mr. Zapruder. And on the 40th, I took 26.6 seconds is what that film runs. The audio portion was 33 seconds. I became somewhat of a plastic surgeon with film. And a little nip and tuck here, I brought it down to 26 and a half seconds, which you'll hear in a moment. And I succeeded in getting a full page in the New York Daily News about adding a voice to history. And we ran that on the 40th anniversary.
So what we were able to do was to replicate what you did for that broadcast using your original interview with Mr. Zapruder and the film. So we are going to show the entire Zapruder film. It is quite graphic, particularly on the big screen, so I just want to advise you what you're about to see.
As they turned, I started shooting the pictures. I saw the motorcycles, and then the car approached, and Jacqueline and the president were waving. And as it came in line with my camera, I heard a shot. I saw the president lean over to Jacqueline. Then the second shot came. And then I realized, I saw his head open up, and I started yelling, "They killed him, they killed him." And I continued shooting until he went under the underpass.
Just extraordinary. So wonderful that you were able to secure that interview, because he passed away just a few years later.
1970, he was 62, I believe.
So that same year, 1966, you met another historic figure, Dr. Martin Luther King, and here you are with Dr. King. That's you smiling at the camera. This is in Mississippi during the March Against Fear, James Meredith's march.
Yes.
And give us a little sense of what it was like to be around Dr. King.
Well, this was after James Meredith had been shot, and he was wounded. He survived. He broke the color barrier at the University of Mississippi, and all the leaders of the civil rights movement picked up the March Against Fear, marching from Mississippi all the way down to Jackson. I picked up the march in Mississippi, near Sardis, Mississippi. Martin Luther King, James Farmer, Floyd McKissick, Stokely Carmichael, they were all there. And they were gathering for this march down Highway 51. I was in radio at that time. That's my recorder slung over around my neck. I went to file a report. Remember telephone booths? I found a telephone booth, but it was unusable because the wires had been cut. And apparently it was the action of some radicals, Ku Klux Klan, I was told, because they didn't want any reports coming out of there. So I had to find a place to buy the phone. I found a nearby junk dealer. I walked in and I feigned my voice a little bit. Told him I was from Columbus because I had worked, or Charleston, one of those towns that existed in Mississippi. My southern accent wasn't too good, but it was enough to have to believe, may I use your phone, sir? I got on the phone and I called the bureau in New York, and I was talking some language that he would like. Meanwhile, my editors in New York said, Marvin, what are you talking about? So I interrupted and I said, excuse me, sir, would you mind, I left something on the front seat of the car. Would you mind going in and getting that? Oh, sure. As he went out, I said, New York, understand this. I'm going to feed stuff from now on. I'm going to put it on tape. I'm here with a junk dealer. He thinks I'm a local kid, so he's letting me use his phone because the KKK has cut all lines. That's how I got my story through, talking about how they were interrupting this march. And they thought I was crazy in New York. But I got the story. That's the bottom line, getting the story, telling the story. But along the way, I walked with them. I stayed in a motel called the Holiday Inn Junior in Sardis, Mississippi. And that's where I became friendly with the owner's daughter, 8-year-old girl. She would see me in the morning sitting there for breakfast on my typewriter. Remember typewriters? And she would come in and she would engage me in conversation, and she learned I was from New York, so I was a Yankee. And one morning I found her looking at me very quizzically. She was staring at me. I said, Donna, what's wrong? She looked and she thought Yankees had horns, big ears. And I reassured her, no, my ears are fine. But that was an experience. But I assured her, we became pen pals after a while. So, but along the march, there was a break we took at one place, and that's when I got to sit down and talk to Dr. King. I had gone across the street during this break at a motel to get a phone, and leaving the motel, coming across the road, I picked up 2 Cokes. Put one on my pocket, drinking one as I crossed the road, and there was Dr. King sitting on a mound of dirt on the other side of the highway. I had already met him during the march. I said, Dr. King, may I join you? He said, yes. I offered him a Coke, and we sat there and chatted maybe about 8-10 minutes. And what he was talking about, he was echoing basically what he had told at the march in Washington a couple of years earlier, that someday we would see someone not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And he talked about the future. He did see and projected that someday we would see someone of color in the White House. And I asked him, this was very prophetic, I asked him a question. I said, Dr. King, basically, there are so many threats on your life. Why do you do this? You have a family, you have children. Why do you do this? There was a pregnant pause. He looked in my eye and he said, for the children, for the children. And so many years later, it's the children who have benefited by his efforts during the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm not so sure he would be totally pleased. There have been so many advances, but there's still more that has to be done. And but he made great progress, and he was one of the things, we have images of people. We see people on television and we see them in person, they don't look the same. Well, Dr. King was very short. He was only about 5'5", but so much taller in stature. And what impressed me most was how he dealt with people. Of course, the marchers were taunted along the march along Highway 51. I remember one day he waved to the field off in a cotton field off in the distance. He said, "Come on, children. Come on, children." And when slowly people came out from the field to join the march, it was another victory for the civil rights movement. One of the moments that really touched me was one day, how I remember this name, stuck with me all these years. Armstead Phipps, 54-year-old sharecropper, who joined the march against his family's wishes. Apparently he had medical problems, but he said he had to do it. He was out in the march for a couple of days, and in the broiling heat, he collapsed. He died. Dr. King, James Farmer, Lloyd McKissick, they all stood over his body under this huge oak tree, reciting the 23rd Psalm. I get a chill just remembering that moment. It was just so moving. Here's a man who had to make a statement, and he made it with his life. It was really a moving moment. But Dr. King, he knew how to deal with the people who were taunting the marchers. The voice of moderation. And when they would bed down each night at some location, James Farmer, who was so articulate, I've interviewed him many times, Lloyd McKissick, Stokely Carmichael, with the radical voice. And that was where I believe the whole Black Power movement began. We need more black mayors. We need more black council members. We need more black police officers. Then Martin Luther King, he got up to speak. And he was the voice of moderation, of peace. And he really left an impact on the people who followed him. And I think he made progress in the civil rights movement. A very impressive man. And I think of all the interviews I've done, he would be one of the iconic interviews I've mastered.
And just less than 2 years after you took this photograph of him, you covered him again, but in a very, very tragic way. After his assassination in Memphis, you went there, and you're actually in this remarkable photograph. You're in the far back of this picture at the funeral home. Tell us a little bit about the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King.
The R.S. Lewis Funeral Home in Memphis. The day he was shot, I was in the office, and immediately they said, "Okay, Marvin, get down to Memphis." Got the next flight. I got there, and I arrived about 5 or 6 in the morning, and I was sitting next to Ike Pappas on the plane. Ike Pappas, who many of you may have known from CBS, who covered wars, and he was a superb reporter. As we were landing, there were riots all over the place. Memphis, all over. Suddenly, as we were landing, the plane was jolted. And Ike was sleeping, and he just bolted from his seat. He thought we were hit. And I did too, at that moment. Didn't realize it was turbulence. We thought something from the ground would hit us. It didn't. It was just some turbulence as we landed. I got to the Lorraine Motel, and you could hear the tears. Police were standing there. People were standing there, just shaking their heads. Who was it? Who was standing here? Who was on the balcony? Jesse Jackson emerged and was telling the reporters there, he cradled him in his arms. I cradled him in my arms. And the shot came from a distance across the road at Bessie Brewer's rooming house. How do I remember that one? Martin Luther King came to Memphis that day to support sanitation workers who were on strike. And that's when he was gunned down. After police had cleared out of the rooming house, I saw him to run over. I got in. I'll never forget it because the stench of the place was such. He entered the bathroom from which James O'Reilly took his shot. stood on the bathtub, 1 foot on the tub, 1 foot on the toilet, looked out the window. You didn't have to be a marksman to make your shot. From there, with a scope, very easy, clear shot to the Lorraine Motel. That's where James Earl Ray took his shot. And those days in Memphis, I know the National Guard came out. And my experience with them, I got to ride with one group of young National Guardsmen. They put me on the highest point of the Jeep. I was a target. So we drove around, and this one young guardsman, yet another thing I remember, waved his carbine in the air. I'll never forget his words. All I want to do is get myself an N head tonight. They were not very sympathetic. Not very sympathetic or upset about the death of Martin Luther King. And they wound up pulling into an apartment complex. They went to a girlfriend's who was having a party. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. So there was the sadness and there was the double sadness, the people, how they reacted to it. And then get to this funeral home. I happened to get in there just as it wasn't open. There were a couple of women who were sobbing in the front row. And I was there with 2 other reporters when Ralph David Abernathy, Andy Young, they all walked in at that moment when I was standing in the background. And it was one of the most frustrating moments of my entire career. I was recording their sound and I was whispering a narrative of what was going on. It was so emotional. Abernathy leaned over the casket, touched King's face, said, "Martin, Martin." Then all 3 of them recited the 23rd Psalm. I thought I had it all on tape until I got outside. The tape got stuck around the capstan, had nothing. No way of duplicating that. One of the other reporters offered me his tape. I took some of the sound, but there was no way of replicating what I said. There was no way at all. So that was a very frustrating moment. Then they had the march, and I went on to Atlanta for the funeral. I remember the cab drive. He took me to my hotel, and he knew I was a reporter, and he asked if I had ever known Dr. King, and I told him about my experience of being with him. And he wouldn't take a fare. He was so touched to meet someone who had touched and met Martin Luther King. This cab driver would not take a fare. I'd push something on him. So it was, that was Martin Luther King. And my experience, that was quite a story to cover.
When you sat down, you should have had cards in your seat for questions for Mr. Scott. If you have questions, if you would just jot those down real quick, our staff will come around and collect those. We'll try to take a few in the next couple of minutes. Marvin, you've had such a remarkable career. You sent me so many great photos before we scheduled this, and I just want to acknowledge some of the stories you covered. We can't talk about the 1960s without acknowledging space, and you were there for moments of tragedy, like the 1967 Apollo 1 fire that killed astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee. But you were also there when Apollo 11 took off on July 16th, 1969. While we're waiting for these questions to come in, do you want to tell us what it was like to see that moment in person?
It was a warm day, and I remember being there. I was among 3,500 reporters from all around 50 countries covered the story, and there were 5,000 guests there, and including Charles Lindbergh was a guest there. Vice President Agnew was there. Lyndon Johnson was there. And there was such excitement that here, after there had been tragedies in the space program, and it set it back, that finally they were achieving the goal. Just the previous Christmas, I think it was Apollo 8, circled around the moon, and it was such a moving moment that here was the time for us to go to the moon. America was ready. In 1961, John Kennedy said, "We will go to the moon in this decade and beyond, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And it was a hardship. And it was the tragedy. And it was Gordon Cooper, who said, "We shall challenge to the moon. The risks are worth the effort to get ahead with the space program." And of course, he was killed in that accident. They had it on launch pad 34 when there was a sudden fire in there, ignited by a break in a wire under Grissom's seat. And that was, we're talking about Apollo 11. It finally was taking off, and Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong, Mike Collins. Apollo 11 lifted up, as you see in that photo, but nothing like being there. We were 3 miles from the launch pad at the press side and the guest side. And it slowly lifted, but millions of pounds of thrust lifting it. And we heard everyone, and even I started screaming, "Go, baby, go! Go, baby, go!" And the whole crescendo, people, "Go, baby, go!" And up into the sky. Suddenly, you saw the separation of the capsule as it went beyond into the blue sky. It was an unforgettable moment. It was. Oof. I can see it now. You know, you talk about these things and you get flashbacks. And I remember that moment. I have seen maybe about 8 or 9 launches from Gemini 9 to when it was the moon port, Cape Canaveral, and they had 3-tier martinis. They had the moon burgers, and it was the moon port in the heyday of the space program. And it was what Wolf wrote in the Right Stuff. And astronauts used to hang out at the Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn were on the pool when they weren't on assignment. Alan Shepard were around there, Walter Cronkite, and on the day of a launch, we would all gather, Cronkite, Bergman, and all the other anchors. They would have breakfast before we would leave the motels for the 15-mile trek over to the Space Center. Those were the days. And you had contractors there handing out all kinds of things and throwing parties and hoping that we reporters would somehow mention their name, that how they were involved in the space program. Those are great days.
And that moment in 1969, what a tremendous culmination of John F. Kennedy's legacy, saying in Houston, "We're going to put a man on the moon before the end of this decade," and sure enough, we did.
Not because it's easy, but because it's hard, and it was, and there were the hardships getting there. It was, but it was. When you think of it, the space program, it's cost us millions of dollars, it's cost lives, but we've all benefited by the byproduct of it. Microchips, for example, heart monitors, GPS, cell phones, all coming out of the space program. All these developments and advances. So we are better off, and as he said, the risks are worth it pursuing this.
Right. Microchips invented right here in Texas at Texas Instruments by Jack Kilby. So yeah, certainly Texas played a part in that experience as well. We have one question for you, going back to the Kennedy assassination and some of your thoughts from earlier. This individual would like to know your thoughts on the Oliver Stone film JFK. I'm assuming you've seen that movie.
A couple of times. It's a good fictional film, in my opinion. But again, it gives rise to all the conspiracy theories. Was it a military thing? But I don't think we're going to have all the answers until the government releases all the documents. And there were hundreds and thousands of pages of documents. But they're being withheld for reasons we don't understand. But they tell us for reasons of national security. What is the national security relating to the assassination that's being withheld? So the Oliver Stone film, first of all, the whole trial, I think, never developed anything. And the suggestion that the government was involved, again, I have no answer to it, but it's one of the theories that persists today. Some people do believe that the government was somehow involved, that it was a military involvement. I have no answer to it. You say, I'm as skeptical as you are.
This is a good question here. Earlier you mentioned other stories you've covered, including 9/11, and I do have a concluding photo here of you at the site of the World Trade Center. And you actually toured the World Trade Center and were up there during construction in the 70s, right?
I was on the 89th or 90th floor during construction.
Wow.
And then I was there years later. Oh, it took years to build it and just minutes for it to come down. And it was a heartbreaking moment for all of us. And it was a difficult story to cover. I said earlier that I had a teardrop. My eyes got watery during one broadcast. I learned about it that morning. We have time to tell the story?
Yeah, go ahead. We have one more question, but go ahead and
Okay.
tell it, a quick version.
The morning of 9/11, I was sleeping late because I was covering the mayoral primary that night. My daughter called me a few minutes after 9, frantically, "Dad, did you see what happened? A plane just crashed over the television." Oh my God. Tried to call my office. All the lines were down. I couldn't get through. Finally, I got my wife on her cell phone and somehow made a connection. One of my editors said, "Well, I was on the other side of Manhattan, right across the river, right across the Hudson, living in New Jersey." And my editor said, "Well, go to this hospital. It's a triage area." And I said, "Triage area? No, I'm coming into the city. This is the big story. I'm going into the city. I want a major part of that story." All right, I tried getting together. If you're going to be in the city, I packed a few things. I raced down just about a mile and a half from where I live. There's a ferry. I figured, okay, get on the ferry. No, New York the city's closed. The cops said, wouldn't let me on. I showed my press pass, wouldn't let me on. I spied a boat at a gas dock, about a 30-foot boat. I raced over there. So, okay. Fortunately, being on television, people get to know who you are. The man recognized me. Sure, come on board. He was trying to get gas, but the gas dock was closed. So I went over and got to the master, and the man who owned the boat had a large party boat, which he was going to use to ferry people across. So I talked the dockmaster into giving him fuel so we could get across and do it. We did. And I'll never forget, and this is another image that stays with me and haunts me sometimes, as we were pulling away from the dock, one woman was screaming, "Please, please, take me, take me. My daughter is there, she needs me." And as I crossed the river, from behind there was the trail of the white wake with a black cloud of smoke coming north over our boat. I got into the city and I expected to be down at ground zero. When I got over there, I saw just a whole line of ambulances, 2 miles of ambulances. I got to the studio. News director rushed me into the studio to get to the anchor desk. One of our prime anchors was on vacation in Europe. So the second anchor, he was on the morning show, so I went in and sat there for about 7 or 8 hours and reporting the story. And it was a couple of days later I finally got down there with the FEMA team. And it was just, I had been there many times before. The governor had an office there, and I brought my children there. We had lunch there at the Windows on the World, which everybody who was up there did not survive. Anyone who was on the high floor didn't survive. That was a moment. It was a moment because this was not a terror attack in some far-off world, which we so often had reported in Tanzania or elsewhere. This was our own backyard. These were our neighbors. These were our viewers who were murdered. And you couldn't help but feel it. As I told earlier, we had one guest in the studio who was convinced her father would survive when we knew it was not, and it was just so emotional. And I remember wiping a tear. We were also concerned. I was trying to reach my wife, and my co-anchor trying to reach her son. We had our own concerns. We were a part of this. We were not a distance from this story. With this story, we were a part of this story.
All of the stories that you've shared with us today and a lot more are in your book, As I Saw It. I want to acknowledge that we have a few copies downstairs in our museum store, but you can also find it online. We're going to conclude with a question that ties in, I think, to the tellings of stories. How do you keep your stories and experiences meaningful and remembered by future generations?
Sessions like this. And it winds up on, as you told me, this winds up on YouTube, where I found only recently the oral history you did with me about 6 years ago is up there. So that's how I keep it alive, or I keep it alive through a book or something I'll write on Facebook when there's a remembrance of a particular event, like one of the space disasters, the Challenger disaster, which I covered extensively, the explosion of TWA 800. But one of those anniversaries come up, I'll write something on my Facebook page as a remembrance. So going back, as I will write something on the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. So that's how I keep it alive. People are encouraging me to write another book. I think I got my best stories in this one, where I capture about 24 of my more memorable stories and a dozen of my more memorable interviews. So that's my answer. That's how I keep it alive.
Wonderful.
And where I tell people stories to hear.
That is what living history is all about. Marvin Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story.
An
with us.
hour is gone by?
Yeah, I know.
Oh my
Time
goodness.
flies. Thank you so much. Thank you folks for being here today.
Thank you.